Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the most dangerous battlefield the 1880s had to offer, a formal dinner party among America's absurdly wealthy. No swords, no cannons, just an obscene amount of silverware, and a room full of people quietly hoping you'll embarrass yourself. This is the Gilded Age, where the Vanderbilts, the Astors and their friends built marble palaces on Fifth Avenue, and then spent their evenings judging each other over soup. And you, my friend, would not last a single course. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A big genuine thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas are what keep this whole thing going, and I really do read every single one. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always the middle of the night somewhere. And if you'd rather drift off with just the audio, the channel is now on Spotify too, with the link waiting for you in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and maybe loosen your collar, because in a moment yours is going to feel very, very tight. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to eat 20 courses while wearing a corset that could crush a walnut? Could you tell the difference between an oyster fork and a fish fork before someone politely destroyed your reputation? Would you survive a meal where the menu is written entirely in French and asking what anything is counts as social suicide? Could you make polite conversation for 3 hours without once mentioning money, politics, or anything remotely interesting? And when the little bowl of lemon water arrives at the end, would you know it's for rinsing your fingertips? Or would you drink from it like a thirsty raccoon and end an entire family's social standing forever? And now, congratulations. You've just arrived at a mansion on Fifth Avenue. The year is 1883. You're wearing borrowed clothes, you own nothing worth mentioning, and there are 14 pieces of silverware laid out in front of you. Good luck. Before you can fail at a dinner party, you first have to be invited to one, and in the Gilded Age that was its own brutal sport. You did not simply get a friendly note saying, "Hey, come over Friday." No. Getting invited meant navigating an invisible web of calling cards, social visits, and unspoken rules so precise they made tax law look relaxed. A stiff little card with your name on it had to be left at the right houses, at the right hours, folded in exactly the right way, or you might as well have set your reputation on fire in the front hall. And if the lady of the house was not receiving visitors that day, a servant would inform you through a barely open door, and you would slink back down the steps knowing you'd been judged and found wanting. Welcome to the paperwork of belonging. Let's start with the card itself, because it was the entire foundation of your social existence. It was a small rectangle of stiff paper, printed with your name in a tasteful, understated font, because anything flashy screamed that you were new money and trying far too hard. You carried a supply of these cards everywhere, tucked into a special little case, and you deployed them like a general moving troops across a map. When you called on a household, you didn't necessarily expect to be let inside. Often the entire point was simply to hand your card to the servant at the door, proving you had made the effort, and then leave. It was social homework, and everyone was grading everyone else. Now, timing was everything. Each respectable lady had what were called her at-home days, specific afternoons when she was willing to receive callers. Show up on the correct day, and you might be ushered into the drawing room for 15 excruciating minutes of small talk. Show up on the wrong day, and you had committed a small but memorable crime. There were even rules about how long a proper visit should last, and overstaying your welcome was the sort of thing that got you quietly crossed off future lists. Then there was the folding, because of course there was. The corners of a calling card could be bent in specific ways to send silent messages. One fold to show you had come in person, another to offer congratulations, another for condolences. It was an entire language made of folded paper, and getting it wrong was like sending a text that auto-corrected into something deeply insulting. You were expected to simply know all of this, because no one was ever going to sit you down and explain it. And an invitation to an actual dinner sat at the very top of this pyramid. It arrived on fine paper, worded formally in the third person, and it demanded a reply worded exactly the same way and sent back promptly. You did not scribble a casual yes. You composed a careful little response as though answering a summons from a monarch, because in the world of the 400 that is more or less what it was. The names on the guest list had been considered, weighed, and approved. Your name being among them meant someone had decided you were worth the risk. So before you have tasted a single oyster, or touched a single fork, you have already survived an obstacle course built entirely out of paper and etiquette. You navigated the cards, the folds, the at-home days, and the formal reply, all for the privilege of walking into a mansion where you will spend the next several hours quietly terrified. Congratulations, the genuinely hard part has not even started, so somehow you got the invitation. Congratulations, now you have to get dressed, and this is where the real suffering begins. Gilded Age formal wear was not clothing so much as it was upholstery for the human body. If you were a man, that meant white tie, a stiff collar that sawed gently at your throat all evening, a starched shirt front hard enough to deflect a fork, and tails you were absolutely not allowed to sit on comfortably. If you were a woman, it meant a corset laced so tightly that nearly fainting was considered a charming personality trait, layered under pounds of silk, boning, and jewellery heavy enough to qualify as strength training. You did not dress for comfort. You dressed to prove that you could afford to be uncomfortable. Let's start with the gentlemen, since their torture was at least a little simpler. White tie was a rigid uniform with almost no room for personality. A black tailcoat, black trousers, a white waistcoat, a white bow tie you almost certainly could not tie yourself, and a shirt with a bosom so heavily starched it could stand up on its own in the corner. The collar was the real villain, a tall, stiff band of starched linen that gripped your neck and forced your chin permanently upward into an expression of mild aristocratic disdain. You could not slouch. You could not turn your head quickly. You essentially became a very well-dressed lamppost. For the ladies, dressing was less an act and more a full military campaign requiring reinforcements. First came the corset, laced by a maid pulling with the grim determination of someone trying to start a stubborn lawnmower, cinching your waist to a fashionable and frankly alarming smallness. On top of that went layers of petticoats, then the gown itself, a heavy architectural creation of silk and satin, often with a train that trailed behind you like a very expensive tail you had to learn to steer. Add long gloves, add elaborate jewellery, add a hairstyle piled high and pinned into total submission, and you now weighed considerably more than you did an hour ago. None of this could be done alone. A gentleman had a valet to help him into his armour, and a lady had a maid who spent hours arranging every layer and every curl. Getting dressed for a single dinner could take the better part of an afternoon, which is genuinely more preparation than most people today put into a wedding, and you did all of it knowing that the moment you arrived someone would inspect your appearance and quietly decide whether your gown was last season, whether your jewels were real, and whether you truly belonged. The discomfort was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the entire point. Clothing this restrictive announced that you did not do physical labour, that you had servants to dress you, and that you could sit rigidly upright through a 3-hour dinner without a single complaint. The tight collar and the tighter corset were a costume that performed wealth, and comfort would have ruined the whole illusion. You suffered beautifully on purpose for status. So you stand there, laced and starched and pinned into a state of elegant paralysis, barely able to breathe and completely unable to bend at the waist. You have not eaten anything yet, which is deeply concerning. because in a short while you will be expected to consume roughly 20 courses inside this contraption. You take one shallow, careful breath, the only kind now available to you, and you head for the carriage, dressed to impress, and quietly wondering if you will make it home alive. It's time to arrive, and even this you can get wrong. You roll up to a Fifth Avenue mansion that looks less like a home and more like a museum that occasionally serves duck. Carriages line the street in a slow, wheezing traffic jam of the ultra-rich, and here is the trap. Arriving too early marks you as desperate, while arriving too late marks you as rude, which leaves a window of acceptable arrival roughly the size of a keyhole. A footman in white gloves opens your carriage door and you step out onto a strip of carpet laid across the sidewalk, so your shoes never once touch common ground. Already you are being watched. You have not said a single word, and somehow you are already behind. Let's talk about the mansion first, because it is designed to make you feel small before you even reach the door. These were not houses in any normal sense. They were palaces built by families with names like Vanderbilt and Astor, stacked with imported marble, carved stone, and enough turrets to make a French chateau feel underdressed. The message was immediate and deliberate. Everything about the building said, "We have more money than you can possibly comprehend, and you are about to eat dinner inside it." Then there is the matter of the carriage itself. Arriving on foot was unthinkable for a guest of any standing, so you came by carriage, which created its own slow, grinding chaos as dozens of them queued along the street to deposit their glittering passengers one at a time. You waited your turn like an aristocratic parking lot. And when you finally reached the entrance, often a covered porch built specifically so the wealthy never had to experience weather, a servant was there instantly to hand you down as though you might shatter on contact with the pavement. The timing, as always, was a trap laid just for you. A formal dinner invitation specified an hour, and you were expected to arrive within a narrow, unspoken window around it. Show up genuinely early, and you looked like a hungry stranger who'd been circling the block for practice. Show up late and you insulted the hostess, disrupted the careful seating, and possibly held up the entire meal, which was a sin roughly on par with arson. The goal was to appear as though you had drifted in effortlessly at exactly the right moment, which required either deep experience or extremely good luck. Once inside, your outerwear became its own small ritual. Servants materialized to take your coat, your hat, your cloak, and your wrap, whisking them away to a cloakroom with quiet efficiency. Ladies might slip off to a room set aside to check their hair and repair whatever damage the carriage ride had inflicted on their carefully constructed appearance. Gentlemen surrendered their coats and squared their shoulders inside their rigid collars. Everyone took one final breath and prepared to be evaluated, and you were being evaluated constantly, from the second the footman opened your door. The way you stepped down, the way you moved, the confidence or the quiet panic in your posture, all of it was noted by the small army of staff and by any guests who happened to be watching from the windows above. In this world, first impressions were formed before a single introduction was ever made, so you have arrived at the correct hour, in the correct carriage, at the correct palace, and surrendered your coat to the correct servant. You have done absolutely everything right so far. And yet, as you walk toward the sound of murmured conversation and clinking crystal, you cannot shake the feeling that the evening has not truly begun to test you yet. You're correct, it has not. Let's talk about the front hall where your name goes to die. Inside the mansion, past marble columns and a staircase wide enough to land a small aircraft on, stands the butler, a man whose entire purpose tonight is to announce you loudly to a room full of strangers who will immediately size you up. You hand over your invitation, you state your name, and he repeats it at a volume that makes quiet escape impossible. If you mumble, if you fidget, If your name happens to be unfashionable, every head turns and every eyebrow rises a fraction of an inch. It is the 1880s version of walking into a meeting with your microphone accidentally unmuted. There is no going back now. Start with the butler himself, because he was no ordinary servant. In a grand household, he was the general of the entire staff, a figure of enormous dignity who ran the domestic machine with military precision. He knew every important family in the city, every rivalry, every scandal, and every face that mattered. When he looked at you and prepared to announce your name, he was performing a quiet act of judgment, and both of you knew it. He had probably announced dukes. Now he had you. The entrance hall was built to impress and to intimidate in equal measure. Soaring ceilings, polished floors, oil paintings of stern ancestors glaring down at you, and a grand staircase designed to make every arrival feel like a small performance. Your footsteps echoed. The air smelled of hothouse flowers and beeswax and money. Somewhere ahead, the low hum of conversation told you that the other guests were already gathered, already talking and already forming the opinions you were about to walk straight into. Then came the announcement. In the most formal households, your name was spoken aloud as you entered the room where the party was assembling, a tradition meant to inform the hostess and the other guests exactly who had arrived. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. It means your entrance was a public event, that a room full of the most powerful and judgmental people in the city turned to look at you the instant your name rang out. There was no slipping in unnoticed, no lurking near the flowers until you felt comfortable. You were introduced whether you liked it or not, and your name carried weight it simply does not carry today. In this world, a name was practically a resume. The old established families recognized one another instantly, and a name they did not recognize prompted immediate silent questions. Who are they? Where is the money from? How exactly did they get in here? A famous name earned warm smiles. An unknown one earned polite, guarded nods and a great deal of quiet speculation behind fans and moustaches. This is also why composure mattered so enormously. You could not visibly flinch at the sound of your own name booming across a marble hall. You were expected to enter smoothly and calmly, as though being loudly announced to a crowd of strangers was simply the natural condition of your life. Any hesitation, any flustered glance around the room hunting for a single friendly face was noted and remembered. The truly polished guest glided in, as if the whole spectacle were faintly beneath their notice. So you take a breath, as much of one as your collar or your corset will allow, and you step forward. The butler draws himself up to his full and considerable height. Your name fills the room. Dozens of eyes swing toward you at once, cool and appraising and utterly unhurried. You have officially been delivered, gift-wrapped and clearly labelled, straight into the lion's den. And the lions have already eaten a dinner exactly like this one 100 times before. Now you're funneled into the drawing room, where everyone gathers before dinner to stand around and quietly assess one another. There is no sitting, not really, and there is definitely no relaxing. This is the mingling phase, a delicate dance of small talk in which you must appear effortlessly charming while secretly terrified. No one brings you a stiff drink to take the edge off, because that would be far too merciful. Instead, you make polite conversation about the weather, the opera, and absolutely nothing of substance, all while trying to remember which of these bejeweled strangers could end your social life with a single unkind whisper. The dinner has not even started, and you are already sweating gently through your borrowed shirt. Understand first why this phase even existed. Guests were expected to arrive before the meal so that everyone could assemble in one room, greet the hosts and be present when dinner was announced. In practice, this created a strange holding pattern. a stretch of time where a group of extraordinarily wealthy people stood around a beautiful room making pleasant noises at one another to pass the time. It was the original awkward pre-meeting mingle, except everyone else was armed with generations of etiquette, and you were armed with nothing but hope and a rented collar. The room itself was a statement. Drawing rooms in these mansions were stuffed with evidence of taste and spending, silk wallpaper, gilded mirrors, imported furniture too delicate to actually sit on, and paintings chosen to signal culture rather than to be enjoyed. You were meant to admire all of it without gawking, because gawking revealed that you were not accustomed to such things, and being unaccustomed was the great unspoken shame of the age. Introductions were a minefield all their own. You did not simply walk up to strangers and introduce yourself, because that was considered forward and slightly vulgar. Instead, a proper introduction was performed by a third person, ideally the hostess or a mutual acquaintance, who presented you to others according to careful rules of rank and gender. Until someone formally introduced you, a person was technically a stranger, and speaking to a stranger uninvited was a small social trespass. So you hovered, waiting to be handed around the room like a plate of something delicate, and then there was the conversation, which had to be pleasant, light, and utterly weightless. You discussed the recent opera, the unusually mild weather, someone's upcoming voyage to Europe, the latest entirely harmless gossip about people not present. What you did not do was say anything genuinely interesting, controversial, or memorable, because in this world being safe was far more valuable than being clever. The goal was to leave everyone with the vague impression that you were agreeable and well-bred, and to leave no impression sharp enough to be used against you later. Meanwhile, beneath all the smiles, everyone was quietly taking inventory. They noticed your clothes, your jewellery, your manners, your ease or your unease. They noted who you spoke to and who bothered to speak to you. A newcomer standing alone too long was a newcomer nobody wanted, and that fact was visible to the entire room. Social survival in these minutes was a matter of always appearing to belong, even when every nerve in your body was quietly screaming that you did not. So you stand there, a glass of nothing in your hand, making weightless remarks about the weather to a countess who's deciding your entire worth in real time. Your collar tightens, your smile begins to ache, and just as you start to believe you might survive the small talk, a servant appears silently in the doorway. The murmuring dies away, and you realize with a lurch that the actual dinner, the real test, is about to begin. Time to greet the hostess, who is quietly the single most powerful person you'll meet all night. In Gilded Age society, the lady of the house was a general, a gatekeeper, and a judge rolled into one glittering package. Think of someone like Caroline Astor, a woman whose approval could launch a family into the highest circles of New York, and whose disapproval could erase them from society entirely. You approach, you offer a small bow or a careful curtsy, and you say something pleasant and forgettable, because being memorable in the wrong way is far more dangerous here than being dull. She smiles at you. You genuinely cannot tell whether it is warmth or the polite beginning of your downfall. Neither can anyone else. That is rather the point. To grasp how much power this woman held, you have to understand how high society actually worked. It was not run by the government or by men in offices. It was run quietly and ruthlessly by a small circle of elite women who decided who was in and who was out. They controlled the guest lists, the introductions and the invitations, and in doing so they controlled the fate of entire families. A gentleman might make the money, but a lady decided whether that money actually bought you a seat at the table. Caroline Astor was the towering example, the reigning queen of New York society for years. Alongside a social arbiter named Ward McAllister, she was associated with the famous idea of the 400, supposedly the number of people who truly mattered in New York society, a figure often linked to how many guests her ballroom could comfortably hold. Whether the number was ever truly precise hardly matters. What matters is that a single woman and her circle could draw a line around all of society and place you firmly on one side of it or the other. This is exactly why greeting her correctly was so loaded. Your approach had to be respectful, but not grovelling, confident, but never familiar. You offered the appropriate gesture, a slight bow or a graceful curtsy, and you spoke briefly and warmly without lingering in front of her. You thanked her for the invitation. You said something kind about her home, and then you moved along, because monopolizing the hostess was both rude and revealing, the unmistakable mark of someone who did not understand their place. The danger was that her graciousness gave you almost nothing to read. A skilled hostess was unfailingly polite to everyone, which meant her warm smile might signal genuine approval, or might be the exact same smile she offered to people she intended to quietly never invite again. You could walk away feeling triumphant and still have failed some invisible test. The uncertainty was itself a form of control, keeping everyone slightly anxious and endlessly eager to please. And her judgment did not end when you walked away. She watched how you conducted yourself for the rest of the evening, how you treated the servants, how you handled the endless parade of courses, whether you knew the rules or merely faked them. All of it fed into a quiet verdict that would decide whether your name appeared on future invitations or slowly vanished from her lists forever. One dinner could open the door to a whole new world, or gently close it in your face. So you make your small bow, you offer your forgettable little pleasantry, and you receive that unreadable smile in return. You've just greeted a woman who wields more social power than most of the men in the room will ever dream of holding, and you have absolutely no idea whether you passed. You drift away as gracefully as your outfit allows, and you quietly resolve to spend the rest of the night being flawless. You will not manage it. Just when you think you can hide quietly in a corner, the hostess does something horrifying. She pairs you off. In Gilded Age dining, you did not choose where to sit or who to talk to. You were assigned a dinner partner based on an invisible ranking system so complicated it may as well have been quantum physics. Rank, title, wealth, marital status, and social standing were all carefully weighed in advance, and the hostess arranged the pairings like a chess master with a grudge. You might be handed off to a visiting duchess, a railroad baron, or a person so far above your station that simply speaking to them feels vaguely illegal. And whoever they turn out to be, you are now stuck with them. For hours. The pairing was not random and it was not casual. Deciding who escorted whom into dinner and who sat beside whom was one of the hostess's most important and most agonized over tasks, sometimes planned days in advance with the help of diagrams and lists. She had to balance rank against rank, avoid seating known enemies together, separate married couples who were traditionally not paired with each other, and somehow make the whole arrangement flow according to precedence. It was seating as strategy, and a single mistake could offend a powerful guest for years. In the most formal households, a gentleman would be quietly informed which lady he was to take into dinner, sometimes by a small card telling him her name. He was then expected to seek her out, offer his arm, and become her designated companion for the entire meal. If you were that gentleman, this meant approaching a woman you may have never met, introducing yourself with perfect composure, and preparing to entertain her through a dinner that could easily last 3 hours or more. No pressure at all. The logic behind the pairings followed rank with almost mathematical cruelty. The most important gentleman escorted the most important lady, and so on down the line, which meant your assigned partner was essentially a public statement about where the hostess believed you belonged. Being paired with someone grand suggested you mattered. being paired with the least important guest at the gathering, quietly, off in the social equivalent of the cheap seats, told you exactly how you were seen. And everyone at the table could read this ranking as easily as you could. Then there was the sheer social endurance the pairing demanded. This was not a person you could politely greet and then abandon. This was your partner, your obligation, your conversational responsibility for the entire meal, or at least until the ritual of turning the table finally released you. If they were delightful, wonderful, you had won the lottery. If they were dull, pompous, or determined to describe their business ventures in exhaustive detail, you were trapped, smiling, nodding, and slowly aging in real time. And you had to make it work regardless, because visible boredom or coldness toward your partner was a serious breach. You were expected to be attentive, charming, and engaged, drawing them out, listening with apparent fascination, and never once letting your eyes wander longingly toward the door. The comfort of your dinner partner was, at least in theory, more important than your own. Their enjoyment was quite literally your job for the evening, so the card is handed over, the name is revealed, and you cross the room to introduce yourself to the stranger who will occupy the next several hours of your life. Maybe you've drawn a witty, warm companion who makes the whole evening bearable. Maybe you've drawn a man who is already inhaling deeply to begin a monologue about freight tariffs. Either way, you offer your arm, you fix your smile carefully into place, and you accept your fate. Choice was never part of the arrangement. Now comes the parade. When dinner is finally announced, you do not simply wander toward the food like a normal hungry human being. Instead, the entire party lines up and processes into the dining room in a strict order of precedence from most important guest to least important, which means you will be somewhere near the very back, shuffling along like the caboose of a very expensive train. You offer your assigned partner your arm, you match their unhurried pace, and you walk in slow ceremonial silence toward a meal you're not remotely qualified to eat. Everyone else knows exactly where they belong in this line, and the fact that you had to glance around to find your spot in it has already been noticed. Of course it has. Understand that this procession was not decoration. It was a public ranking of every single person in the room, performed slowly and in full view. The order in which people entered the dining room announced their exact place in the hierarchy, and everyone present understood how to read it. Walking into dinner was, in effect, a live leaderboard of social importance, and you were a participant whether you wanted to be or not. The host typically led the way, and here is a detail that surprises people. He did not escort his own wife. Tradition dictated that the host offered his arm to the most distinguished lady present, the guest of honour, while the hostess was escorted in by the most important gentleman, often entering last rather than first. Married couples were generally split up for the evening entirely, so the whole affair began by politely separating spouses and rearranging everyone by status, which is a genuinely strange way to start a meal when you stop and think about it. You and your assigned partner took your place in this careful sequence according to your combined rank. If the two of you were important, you moved toward the front. If you were not, you drifted toward the rear, following the backs of people grander than yourselves down a hallway lined with more wealth than most people would ever see in a lifetime. The pace was slow and dignified. There was no rushing, no eager scurrying toward the smell of food, because visible enthusiasm was for people who were not accustomed to being fed like this. The dining room you were processing toward was its own spectacle, and the slow walk gave you plenty of time to take it in and be intimidated by it. Enormous tables gleamed beneath chandeliers and candlelight. Flowers and silver stretched away into the distance. Servants stood ready and emotionless against the walls like well-dressed statues. Everything had been arranged to be seen, and your ceremonial approach ensured that you saw all of it, and that the room, in turn, saw you. There was also a quiet art to the walk itself. You had to move at your partner's pace, neither dragging them along nor lagging behind, offering your arm at the correct height, making light murmured conversation if the moment allowed, and generally behaving as though gliding into dinner in a ranked procession was the most natural thing in the world. Any stumble, any confusion about which way to go, any awkwardness with your partner was on full display for all the guests filing along behind you. So you shuffle forward in your assigned position, arm politely extended, partner at your side, following a slow river of silk and starch toward the dining room. You are near the back, which tells everyone precisely how the hostess ranked you, and there is nothing whatsoever to be done about it now. You reach the doorway. The candlelight glitters across an ocean of silverware, and the real gauntlet, the one made of forks and rules and endless courses, is finally about to begin. You reach the table, and now you must find your seat, which is a test cleverly disguised as a courtesy. Each place is marked with a small card bearing a name written in elegant script, and yours is somewhere out there in the vast landscape of china and crystal, probably nowhere near anyone you would actually want to sit beside. Seating in the Gilded Age was pure warfare. Being placed near the host meant you mattered, while being seated at the far end near the drafts, and the least important guest told the entire room exactly what the hostess thought of you. You locate your card, you sit, and you try not to calculate your social value based on how many people are wedged between you and the guest of honour. You do it anyway. The place card system existed for a reason, and that reason was control. The hostess had spent real effort deciding exactly where every guest would sit, and she was not about to let anyone rearrange her careful plan by simply plopping down wherever they liked. Small cards, often beautifully printed or handwritten, marked each assigned spot. You were expected to find yours quietly and without fuss, and to sit precisely where you were told. Wandering the length of the table looking lost while hunting for your name was not a great look, but sitting in the wrong place was infinitely worse. The arrangement itself was a map of power. The most honoured guests sat closest to the host and hostess, radiating outward in descending order of importance toward the ends of the table. This meant your assigned seat was a public verdict. If you found yourself near the head, you had been judged worthy of proximity to the people who mattered most. If you found yourself marooned at the far end, surrounded by other minor guests and the occasional draught from a doorway, the message was gentle but completely unmistakable. You were tolerated, not treasured, and everyone could read this map at a glance. The guests were intimately familiar with how seating worked, so they knew instantly who had been elevated and who had been quietly demoted since the last gathering. A person who had climbed in the hostess's favour might find themselves seated higher than before, and the whole table would notice. Someone who had fallen out of favour might be placed conspicuously lower, a soft public punishment delivered entirely through the position of a name card. It was social scorekeeping conducted in polished silence. There were also the small mechanics of actually sitting down, which offered fresh chances to stumble. A gentleman was often expected to help the lady beside him into her chair before taking his own seat, a gesture requiring you to manage her chair, her train, and your own rigid clothing all at once without knocking anything over. You settled in without scraping the chair loudly, without bumping the table and rattling the towering arrangement of glassware, and without visibly reacting to whoever fate and the hostess had placed on either side of you. Because those neighbours were now your entire world. The person to your left and the person to your right would be, thanks to the strict rules of conversation, your complete social universe for the duration of the meal. Finding a beloved friend beside you was a small miracle. Finding a stranger, a rival, or the dreaded monologuing businessman was simply your assignment, and you were expected to make the very best of it with a warm and untroubled expression. So you find your little card, You slide gracefully into your appointed place, and you perform the quiet mental arithmetic of counting the seats between you and the guest of honour. The number is not flattering. You smile anyway, unfold your napkin into your lap, and prepare to face the glittering arsenal laid out before you. Your seat has already told the room what you're worth. Now the silverware will decide whether you can prove otherwise. Let's talk about the table itself, because it is designed to intimidate you, and it is working. Stretched out before you is a landscape of gleaming china, polished crystal, folded linen, and enough silver to fund a small war. There are plates stacked upon plates, glasses arranged in careful formation, and tiny mysterious tools whose purpose you cannot even begin to guess. Flowers tower in the centre in great fragrant walls. Candles flicker in silver holders down the length of it. Somewhere hidden in all this glittering chaos is the correct way to proceed, and you have not been given a map. To the people around you, this is just another Tuesday. To you, it looks like the cockpit of an aircraft you're about to fly directly into the side of a mountain. Start with the linen, because even the tablecloth was a statement. The finest households dress their tables in spotless white damask, heavy and gleaming and pressed to absolute perfection, sometimes with matching napkins folded into elaborate shapes almost too impressive to unfold. This was fabric that existed purely to demonstrate that the household could afford beautiful things and an entire army of servants to keep them immaculate. You were about to eat roughly 20 courses over it without spilling a single drop, which felt less like dining and more like a dare issued by the furniture. Then there was the centrepiece, which in the grandest homes was a genuine spectacle. Towering arrangements of hothouse flowers, elaborate silver structures holding fruit and sweets and yet more flowers, candelabra dripping with soft candlelight, all marching down the middle of the table in a display meant to overwhelm. These arrangements could be so tall and so dense that you literally could not see the guests seated across from you, which was arguably a mercy, since it meant fewer witnesses to your quiet struggle. The glassware alone was enough to induce a small panic. At each place stood a cluster of glasses of different shapes and sizes, one for water, and several more for the various wines that would accompany the meal. To the untrained eye, it looked like a delicate crystal forest sprouting straight out of the table, and you had no idea which glass was destined for which drink. Guessing wrong was not catastrophic all by itself, but it was one more little opportunity to reveal that you didn't quite know what you were doing here. And presiding over all of it was the china, the plates that would arrive and depart in a steady rotation throughout the meal. At many formal dinners, a large decorative plate sat waiting at your place when you arrived, a kind of placeholder that would be swapped out as the courses came and went. Each dish had its own appropriate plate, and the whole thing was managed by servants with a choreography so smooth it made your own uncertainty feel even more glaringly obvious. You were the only person at this table who did not know the dance. The point of all this splendour was never merely to hold food. It was to display wealth, taste, and control on a scale designed to impress and to slightly unnerve. A table like this announced that the host had the money to acquire it, the knowledge to arrange it correctly, and the trained staff to maintain and serve it flawlessly. It was a performance in porcelain and silver, and you were seated right in the middle of it, expected to perform your own small part without a single visible mistake. So you sit before this dazzling, bewildering expanse, taking in the towering flowers, the crystal forest, the endless silver, and the pressed white linen. It is beautiful. It is intimidating. And somewhere in it, are more than a dozen forks and spoons you're about to have to use in the exact correct order. You take one careful, shallow breath, the only kind your outfit permits. The first course is coming, and the table, for all its beauty, is quietly waiting for you to fail. Now, the silverware, which is quietly the single greatest trap ever laid for an unprepared dinner guest. Laid out around your plate is an entire battalion of forks, knives, and spoons, sometimes more than a dozen separate pieces, each one intended for a specific course and absolutely nothing else. There is a fork for oysters, a fork for fish, a fork for the entree, and at least one fork whose job you will simply never understand. The rule is easy to state and nearly impossible to survive. You work from the outside in, one utensil per course. Reach for the wrong one, and while no one will say a word out loud, every experienced diner at the table will note it in silence and file it away forever. It is judgment by cutlery, and you are already losing. Let's start with the one merciful principle, the outside-in rule, because it is the closest thing you have to a lifeline. The utensils were arranged in the order you would need them, the tools for the earliest courses placed farthest from the plate, and the ones for the later courses tucked closest in. In theory, this meant you could simply reach for the outermost fork or spoon each time a new dish arrived and trust the arrangement to guide you. In practice, it meant that a single wrong move early on could throw off the entire sequence and leave you stabbing dessert with an oyster fork. Then there was the sheer, dizzying specialization of it all. This was an age obsessed with having exactly the right implement for every conceivable task, and the silver manufacturers were thrilled to oblige. There were small forks made only for oysters, knives and forks shaped specifically for fish, spoons sized precisely for soup, and separate tools waiting for the salads, the sweets, and the fruit. Some households owned specialized pieces so obscure that even seasoned diners occasionally paused, wondering what on earth they were meant to do with the strange little object in front of them. The material itself carried its own weight of meaning. Solid silver, often heavy in the hand and polished to a mirror shine by servants whose entire job was to keep it gleaming, announced the wealth of the household with every course. Owning enough matched silver to lay a dozen pieces at each place, for a table of many guests represented a genuine fortune. The forks in front of you were not just tools, they were money, arranged in rows, glittering under the candlelight and quietly daring you to make a mistake. And mistakes were noticed, always. No one would ever correct you aloud, because pointing out another guest's error was itself terribly rude. Instead, your fumble simply registered. The lady beside you would catch it. A servant would catch it. Somewhere down the table, someone would catch it and store it away as a small, delicious piece of evidence that you did not truly belong. In this world, the cruelest judgments were the ones delivered entirely in silence. The safest strategy, and the one adopted by every nervous newcomer, was to watch someone else and copy them a half-second later. You waited to see which fork your more confident neighbour selected, and then you selected the same one, trying to make it look like an independent decision. It was cheating, technically, but it was survivable, and survival was the only goal that mattered here. So you stare down at the gleaming rows of forks and spoons flanking your plate, a small silver army awaiting deployment, and you remind yourself of the one rule you know: outside in, one piece per course, you can do this. Then the very first course arrives, you glance down at the arrangement and you realize with a cold flush that you have already lost track of which fork is which. It is going to be a long evening. A small card sits near your plate, and it turns out to be the menu, written entirely in French. This is not an accident. In the Gilded Age, printing the menu in French signalled sophistication, and it also conveniently separated the people who belonged from the people who were merely visiting. You squint down at words like consommé, riz de veau, and suprême de volaille, and you slowly realize you have no idea what is about to be placed in front of you. Asking anyone for a translation is completely out of the question, because admitting you do not read French at a table like this is roughly equivalent to admitting you wandered in off the street. So you nod knowingly at the little card. You understand nothing. You commit fully to the bit. understand first why the menu was in French at all, in the middle of an American dinner party attended entirely by English speakers. French was the language of high cuisine, of the great chefs and the grand restaurants, and printing your dinner in it draped the whole meal in an air of European refinement. It signalled that your kitchen was serious, your chef was probably French or trained in the French style, and your household understood the finer things. It also quietly filtered the room, since the truly cultured were expected to read it with ease, and the pretenders were left squinting. Then there was the menu card itself, which was often a small work of art. Printed on fine cardstock, sometimes decorated, occasionally personalised, it listed the courses in order so guests could see the magnificent journey that lay ahead of them. In the grandest homes, these cards might even be keepsakes, tiny souvenirs of an extravagant evening. To you, however, this beautiful little card was less a souvenir and more a coded threat, a list of unfamiliar dishes you would soon be expected to eat correctly. The words themselves were a maze. Consommé was a clear soup, though you might not know that yet. Riz de veau was sweetbreads, which, in a truly cruel twist of language, are not sweet and are not bread, but are in fact the thymus or pancreas of a calf. Suprême de volaille was a refined chicken dish. Every line held a small trap, a dish that sounded elegant and mysterious, and gave you no clue whether you were about to eat fish, fowl, organ meat, or something you would rather not identify at all. And here was the true cruelty. You could not ask. Turning to your neighbour and quietly requesting a translation would instantly reveal that you did not read French, which in this company was a quiet confession that you did not belong among them. So you were left to bluff, to nod at the card with an expression of pleasant recognition, to murmur that the menu looked delightful while having no earthly idea what most of it meant. You were performing fluency you did not possess. There was at least one small advantage buried in the ordeal. Because the courses arrived one at a time and were often announced or served by attentive footmen, you could sometimes wait and simply see what appeared on your plate. The menu told you a course was coming. The plate eventually told you what it actually was. Between the two, you might just piece together enough understanding to avoid disaster. So you set the beautiful little card down with a confident air of someone who reads French menus every day of their life, when in truth you have decoded exactly one word on it, and are not even certain about that one. The first course is on its way. You will meet each dish as a complete surprise, smiling as though you expected it all along. In the Gilded Age, even the menu was a test, and you're already faking your way through it. You brace yourself for dinner, and then you learn the truly terrifying truth. This meal has no reasonable end. A formal Gilded Age dinner could stretch across 10, 15, even 20 separate courses, unfolding over 3 hours or more of relentless eating while being watched. Soup, fish, meat, game, sweets, savouries, and things you cannot possibly identify arrive in a slow and endless tide. Each course is small, but they simply never stop coming, and refusing food outright is frowned upon. This is not a meal. It is a marathon with a dress code, and somewhere around course number 7, sealed inside a corset or a collar that no longer permits deep breathing, you begin to quietly understand that you may not physically make it to dessert. The reason for all this endless procession was a style of serving that had taken over fashionable dining, in which dishes were brought out one course at a time in sequence by a steady stream of servants. Instead of loading the whole table with food all at once and letting guests help themselves, each course was presented, served, eaten, and then whisked away before the next one arrived. This meant the meal unfolded like a slow, stately performance, one act at a time, for hours on end. And each of those acts was its own small production. A single course was not simply a plate of food set down and forgotten. It was carried in, offered, portioned, accompanied by its correct wine, and eventually cleared, all according to a precise choreography performed by footmen who had done it 1,000 times. Multiply that careful ritual by 20, and you begin to grasp why a formal dinner devoured entire evenings. You were not just eating, you were sitting through an opera made of food. The variety was genuinely staggering. You might begin with oysters, move through a soup or two, then fish, then a series of smaller made dishes, then a grand roast, then game, then salads, then sweets, then fruit, then tiny savoury bites at the very end, with a cold palate cleanser sometimes slipped in partway through to reset your exhausted mouth. Each course was modest in size, which was the only thing that made survival even theoretically possible, but the sheer number of them defeated all but the most seasoned diners. Here lay the cruelest mechanic of all. You could not simply opt out. Waving away course after course, or leaving your plates conspicuously untouched, risked looking ungracious, ungrateful or unwell, and drawing exactly the kind of attention you were desperate to avoid. So you were expected to accept and taste your way through the entire endless sequence, taking at least a polite bite of each, even as your appetite vanished, your stomach protested, and your garments quietly reached the limits of their engineering. The endurance required was as much physical as social. Sitting upright for 3 or 4 hours, laced or starched into rigid formal wear, making constant conversation while sampling dish after dish and sip after sip of wine, was genuinely exhausting. The wealthy trained for this their entire lives without realizing it, the way athletes train. You, an unprepared outsider, were being thrown into the deep end of a competition you did not know existed until this evening. So you sit there as the plates come and go in hypnotic, seemingly infinite rhythm, each one a fresh little challenge of the correct fork and the correct manners. You have lost count of the courses, your waistband is issuing formal complaints, and when you cautiously ask yourself how much longer this can possibly go on, the answer, delivered by yet another footman setting down yet another plate, is always the same. Longer, much longer. The first course arrives, and it is oysters, because of course it is. Raw, cold, and glistening on a bed of ice, they sit before you, practically daring you to eat them correctly. In the Gilded Age, oysters were wildly fashionable and shockingly plentiful, hauled in by the millions, and served at the start of nearly every important dinner. There is naturally a special little fork just for them, and a precise, quiet method for lifting each oyster from its shell, without slurping, splashing, or making the frankly reasonable face that a raw mollusk deserves. You spear one. It seems to stare back at you. You tip it into your mouth and try very hard to look like this is something you enjoy, and have always enjoyed. Only 19 courses to go. To understand the oyster's reign, you have to understand just how abundant it once was. The waters around cities like New York teemed with oysters in almost unimaginable quantities, and they were harvested and sold in staggering numbers. Far from being a rare luxury, oysters were eaten by nearly everyone, from the wealthiest households to the humblest street stalls. Oyster cellars and saloons flourished throughout the city, serving them by the plateful to anyone with a few coins. The oyster was genuinely the fast food of its time, but at a fine dinner, the oyster was elevated into an occasion. Served raw and cold on crushed ice, often at the very start of the meal, it was the elegant opening note of the entire performance. Its presence signalled freshness, wealth, and fashion all at once. Beginning a great dinner with oysters was simply what one did, and the finest homes took pride in the quality and origin of the ones they served. Then, of course, there was the fork. This being an age that manufactured a dedicated utensil for nearly everything, the oyster earned its own small 3-tined fork, designed specifically for lifting the delicate morsel from its shell. Using it correctly required a certain quiet finesse. You held the shell steady, worked the little fork beneath the oyster to loosen it, and conveyed it to your mouth in one smooth, discreet motion, all without slurping, dripping, or otherwise drawing attention to the fundamentally strange act of eating something raw and alive minutes earlier. For the uninitiated guest, this presented an immediate crisis of nerve. A raw oyster is a challenging thing to eat gracefully, even when you enjoy them, and if you did not, you were still expected to consume it with an air of practiced pleasure. Grimacing was not permitted. Hesitating too long was noticed. You could not poke at it suspiciously, or ask what exactly you were supposed to do with the accompanying lemon or the tiny fork. You simply had to perform enjoyment, convincingly, from the very first course, and that was perhaps the most daunting part. The oysters came first, which meant your very opening move at the table, the first thing the whole room might glimpse you doing, was navigating a slippery raw mollusk with a specialized fork you had possibly never held before. There was no gentle warm-up course to ease you in. You were tested immediately, on shellfish, under candlelight, in front of everyone. So you steady the cool, ridged shell, slide the little fork beneath the glistening oyster, and lift it toward your mouth with all the false confidence you can summon. It slips down cold and briny and strange. You set the empty shell down without a sound and arrange your face into an expression of mild, aristocratic satisfaction. You have survived the opening course, and already somewhere down the long glittering table, the next plates are being carried in. Next comes the soup, and if you thought soup at least would be safe, think again. Even this humble bowl is governed by an exhausting little set of rules. You must tilt the bowl gently away from you, never toward you, and spoon the soup outward, away from your body, as though you are quietly rowing a tiny boat across a shallow lake of broth. You sip from the side of the spoon, never the tip, and you make absolutely no sound at all, because slurping is the kind of thing that gets whispered about for an entire generation. The spoon is enormous, the bowl is shallow, and the whole process seems engineered specifically to catch you in a mistake. You lift the spoon. Your hand shakes just slightly. Everyone can see it. Begin with the strange choreography of the spoon itself, because this was the rule everyone knew and everyone feared. You dipped the spoon into the soup and moved it away from you, toward the far edge of the bowl rather than dragging it toward yourself. The polite explanation involved avoiding drips down your front, but really it was simply the done thing, a small learned motion that instantly marked whether you'd been raised at tables like this one. Move the spoon the wrong direction and you announced yourself as an outsider without saying a word. Then there was the matter of sound, which was treated with genuine seriousness. Soup was to be consumed in total silence. No slurping, no loud sipping, no scraping of the spoon against the bowl. You brought the spoon to your mouth and sipped from its side rather than shoveling from its tip, drawing the soup in quietly and without spectacle. In a room where every small noise seemed amplified by the hush of good manners, an accidental slurp rang out like a dropped tray. The bowl and spoon themselves conspired against you. Formal soup was often served in a wide, shallow bowl or plate, rather than a deep vessel, which made the outward spooning motion easier, but also left less room for error. And the spoon was large, rounded, and heavy, requiring a steady and confident hand to lift a full portion of hot liquid smoothly to your lips without a single wobble or splash onto that pristine white damask beneath you. There was etiquette even in how you finished. When you neared the bottom, you were permitted to tilt the bowl slightly away from you to gather the last spoonfuls, but only ever away, never toward. And when you were done, or done enough, you rested your spoon in the correct position, signalling quietly to the ever-watchful servants that this course, for you, was complete. Every stage of the humble soup had its own small script. It is worth appreciating just how absurd this all was. Soup is perhaps the simplest, most comforting food imaginable. and here it had been transformed into a delicate test of coordination, silence, and learned motion, performed under the watchful eyes of a room full of people ready to judge. A dish designed across human history to warm and soothe had become, in this setting, another quiet opportunity to expose yourself as someone who did not belong. So you take up the heavy spoon, dip it, and push it carefully away from you across the shallow bowl, lifting it in silence to sip from its side without the faintest sound. Your hand trembles just enough to send a tiny ripple across the surface. No one comments. No one ever comments. But the ripple was seen, and it has been noted, and you still have around 18 courses of increasingly complicated food waiting patiently ahead of you. Now the fish course glides in, and with it, more specialised weaponry. There is a fish fork and a fish knife, both shaped differently from their ordinary cousins, and using a normal knife on your fish is the kind of error that reveals you as an outsider instantly. The fish itself arrives elegantly boned and gently sauced, and you're expected to eat it delicately, without flipping it, mangling it, or accidentally launching a piece of it across the table into a passing countess. The trick is to look as though you have eaten sole in cream sauce 1,000 times before, and found it all mildly boring. Inside, you are performing frantic mental calculations about which utensil is which. Outside, you must appear serenely, aristocratically, effortlessly unbothered. Start with the tools, because the fish course came armed with its own peculiar set. A fish knife was shaped quite differently from a regular dinner knife, broader and often with a distinctive blade, designed not for cutting through tough meat, but for gently separating delicate fish and easing it away from any remaining bones. Alongside it sat a matching fish fork. Reaching instead for a standard knife to attack your fish was a small but glaring blunder, the kind that experienced diners registered immediately, and outsiders never even knew they had committed. The fish itself was prepared to be elegant and unthreatening. It arrived filleted or carefully boned, dressed in a refined sauce, presented so that it could be eaten with grace rather than wrestled with. This was not a whole fish glaring up at you with its head still attached. It was a civilized, sauced, boneless offering, engineered for delicate consumption. And yet even this genteel presentation left ample room for disaster in the hands of a nervous newcomer. The great fear was the bone. Even in carefully prepared fish, a stray small bone might occasionally survive, and dealing with it presented its own etiquette minefield. You could not simply spit it out, nor make a great production of your discovery, nor recoil in alarm. There were quiet, discreet ways to remove such a thing, performed with minimal fuss and maximum composure, and knowing how to handle the moment gracefully was yet another mark of breeding you may not have possessed. Then there was the matter of pace and portion. Like every course in this endless meal, the fish was to be eaten in moderate, measured bites, without haste and without any visible eagerness. You cut small, controlled portions with the fish knife, lifted them delicately with the fish fork, and chewed without hurry, all while maintaining light conversation with the dinner partner currently assigned to you. Eating and talking and behaving flawlessly all at once was the entire skill of the evening compressed into a single course, and underneath it all ran the same relentless current of observation. The fish course was still relatively early in the meal, which meant the room was fresh, the guests were alert, and any misstep would be caught by fully rested eyes. Choosing the wrong utensil, mishandling a bone, or eating with clumsy enthusiasm here, near the beginning of the long parade, set an early impression that would colour how you were judged for the rest of the night. So you select the correctly shaped fish knife and fish fork, hoping you have guessed right, and you work at the delicate sauced fillet before you in small, careful, unhurried bites, chatting pleasantly all the while as though none of this required a shred of concentration. a tiny bone reveals itself. You deal with it discreetly, or you pray you have. You set your specialized tools down at the proper angle, and you brace yourself because the fish was only ever a warm-up. The heavy courses are coming next. By now the courses are beginning to blur together, and here come the entrees and the removes, a rotating cast of rich, elaborate dishes designed to keep the meal grinding relentlessly forward. In Gilded Age terms, the entrees were the smaller-made dishes served between the larger courses, things swimming in sauces and stacked with garnishes you cannot name. Just as you finish one plate, a silent servant whisks it away and replaces it with another and then another, in a hypnotic cycle that seems built to slowly break your spirit. You're not hungry anymore. You stopped being hungry 3 courses ago. But stopping is not an option here. So you take a polite bite of everything, quietly praying that your straining waistband can hold the line. Let's untangle the terminology, since the middle of a Gilded Age dinner had its own vocabulary designed to confuse you. The entrees were not, as the modern word suggests, the main event. They were the smaller, fancier-made dishes, often elaborate creations in rich sauces, served in the stretch between the fish and the great roasts. The removes were the substantial courses that followed and, in a sense, replaced them at the centre of the meal. It was an entire architecture of eating, layered and sequenced, that everyone at the table understood except you. These middle courses were where the kitchen truly showed off. A great chef poured his creativity into these elaborate little dishes, sculpted and sauced and garnished into small edible showpieces. They were designed to impress, to demonstrate skill and expense, and to keep the parade of novelty marching along so no guest ever grew bored. Each one was a fresh flavour, a fresh presentation, and, for you, a fresh puzzle, of which fork to select and how to eat it without embarrassment. Somewhere in the middle of all this, in the grandest dinners, came a small mercy disguised as another course. A cold palate cleanser, sometimes a sorbet or an icy spiked punch, was served partway through the meal to refresh the exhausted mouth, and, according to the theory of the age, revive the flagging appetite for the courses still to come. It was a brief, cool pause in the relentless richness, a chance to reset before the heaviest dishes arrived. It also confirmed something alarming, that the meal was engineered to continue long past the point of natural fullness. The rhythm of it all was hypnotic and merciless. A plate would arrive, you would eat, and before you had quite finished, a footman would appear at your shoulder to clear it and set down the next. There was no lingering, no long, comfortable pause, no chance to quietly recover. The courses came and went with the steady, unstoppable regularity of a machine, and you were simply expected to keep pace with a smile fixed on your face. By this stage, the real challenge was no longer knowledge but endurance. You had, perhaps, more or less figured out the general rhythm of forks and manners. What defeated you now was sheer volume, the physical reality of consuming polite bites of dish after rich dish, while sealed into unforgiving formal wear, all without ever appearing to strain or flag or wish the whole thing would end. Your body had reached its limits several courses ago. The meal had not. So the plates keep coming, a blur of sauced and garnished creations you can no longer distinguish from one another, each swept away and instantly replaced before you can catch your breath. You take another small, dutiful bite. You murmur that it is wonderful. You're running on manners and willpower alone now, and when you dare to hope the end might be near, another footman glides silently to your side with yet another plate. The roast, you realise with quiet horror, has not even arrived. The heavy artillery arrives now, the roast and the game course. This is the muscular heart of the meal, where great cuts of beef, saddles of mutton and wild game make their grand entrance. and in the very finest Gilded Age homes, this meant delicacies like canvasback duck and terrapin, a kind of turtle stew that the truly rich adored and that cost a small fortune to serve. To the people around you, terrapin is a rare and thrilling treat. To you, it is a bowl of warm mystery that you must consume with visible enthusiasm and the correct implement. You take a careful bite. It tastes like the ocean had a serious disagreement with a swamp. You smile warmly. You murmur that it is simply divine. You have officially learned to lie with your entire face. Understand first that these were the courses meant to impress, the ones that announced the wealth and ambition of the household most loudly. A grand roast, a saddle of mutton, a magnificent joint of beef carved with ceremony. These were the substantial, splendid centerpieces around which the whole meal had been building. After the delicate oysters, the silent soup, the refined fish, and the elaborate little entrees, the arrival of the great roast was the meal flexing its muscles. The game course was where things grew truly rarefied. Wild birds and game were prized for their difficulty and their expense, and serving them signalled a table of the highest order. Among the most coveted was the canvasback duck, a wild duck famous for its flavour, and hunted in ways that made it costly and fashionable. To serve canvasback was to serve status itself, a dish the whole table would recognise as a mark of a truly serious kitchen. And then there was terrapin, perhaps the strangest luxury of the age. This was a stew made from a particular kind of turtle, prepared elaborately and regarded by wealthy diners as one of the great delicacies available to them. It was expensive, laborious to prepare, and deeply fashionable, the sort of dish that appeared at the finest dinners precisely because it was so difficult and costly to produce. To the elite, a serving of terrapin was a genuine thrill. To an outsider encountering it for the first time, it was a warm, rich, faintly aquatic mystery arriving in a bowl. Here was the quiet trap the game course laid for you. These dishes were unfamiliar, strongly flavoured, and utterly foreign to anyone not raised on them, and yet you were expected to receive them not merely with acceptance, but with delight. Recoiling from the terrapin, hesitating over the game, or failing to recognise the honour of what you were being served would have marked you instantly. You had to perform connoisseurship, nodding at the canvasback as though you had strong opinions about it, savouring the terrapin as though it were an old and cherished friend. The correct tools and techniques added their usual layer of difficulty. Game and roast meats came with their own implements and their own quiet expectations about how they should be cut, portioned and eaten. But by this point in the meal, the deeper challenge was psychological. You were full, you were tired, you were facing genuinely unusual food, and you were required to greet all of it with the easy, practiced enthusiasm of someone who dined this way every single night. So you accept your portion of the prize canvasback and your share of the celebrated terrapin, and you eat them with an expression of deep, knowing pleasure, while your body quietly begs you to stop. The terrapin tastes like a swamp and an ocean settling a dispute in your mouth. You call it divine. You call it exquisite. You have mastered at last the essential Gilded Age skill of lying gracefully with a full mouth and a straining waistband, and the meal, incredibly, is still not over. Let's address the small forest of glasses standing to your right, because each of those endless courses comes paired with its own wine. A proper Gilded Age dinner poured a different wine for nearly every stage of the meal. Sherry with the soup, white with the fish, claret and champagne as the courses climb toward their peak, each in its own specific and slightly different glass. Servants materialize out of nowhere to refill you constantly, and here lies a beautifully cruel trap. Drink too little, and you seem stiff and ungrateful. Drink too much, and you become the story everyone tells for years. Somewhere between the fourth and fifth glass, with your corset or collar quietly cutting off circulation, you realize you're being gently, elegantly, and expensively poisoned by pure hospitality, start with the sheer logic of the wine pairings, because it followed the food with real precision. Different wines were matched to different courses, each chosen to complement what you were eating at that moment. A fortified wine like sherry might accompany the soup, a crisp white was poured for the fish, richer reds like claret arrived with the meats and game, and sparkling champagne bubbled up as the meal reached its grandest heights. Sweet wines came later with the sweets. The whole progression was a carefully composed liquid soundtrack to the food. This meant naturally a different glass for nearly every wine, which is why your place setting sprouted an entire cluster of crystal. There were glasses of varying shapes and sizes, each intended for a particular kind of wine, arranged near your plate in their own small formation. To the practiced diner, this was simply the natural order of things. To you, it was one more layer of possible failure, a crystal forest in which reaching for the wrong glass at the wrong moment offered yet another chance to expose yourself. The servants made moderation genuinely difficult. Attentive footmen moved constantly around the table, refilling glasses almost the instant they dipped below full, so that you often could not even track how much you had actually consumed. Your glass simply never seemed to empty. Over the course of a meal that spanned many courses and many hours, this quiet, relentless topping up could carry you well past sensible limits before you had any clear sense of how far you'd gone, and this created the evening's most treacherous social tightrope. Drinking too little looked stiff, ungracious, and faintly insulting to a host who had spent a fortune assembling these fine wines. But drinking too much was catastrophic in a different way. Becoming visibly tipsy, growing loud, saying something unwise, or losing your careful composure at a table where composure was everything, could undo an entire evening of flawless behaviour in a single unguarded moment. You had to sip enough to seem appreciative and stop somewhere short of disaster, with no clear marker of where that line lay. The physical reality made it all worse. You were consuming wine after wine on a stomach compressed by a corset, or a body constrained by a rigid collar, in a warm room lit by many candles over the course of hours. The heat, the tight clothing, the rich food, and the steady flow of alcohol combined into a slow, creeping haze. Staying sharp, upright, and articulate under these conditions was its own quiet feat of endurance, one the seasoned guests managed with maddening ease. So you sip carefully from what you hope is the correct glass, trying to appear both appreciative and entirely in control, while a footman glides up yet again to refill the one you had barely touched. The candlelight seems a little softer now, the conversation a little warmer, your judgment a little looser. Somewhere past the fifth glass you understand the true danger of Gilded Age hospitality. It does not attack you, it simply keeps pouring, smiling all the while until you defeat yourself. Here is a rule that will haunt you all evening. You must never, ever appear to actually want the food. In Gilded Age high society, visible hunger was vulgar, a sign that you were somehow not accustomed to abundance. So even as 20 courses parade past you in an endless tide, you're expected to eat lightly, delicately, and with an air of faint indifference, as though this staggering feast is simply another Tuesday and rather beneath your notice. Clean your plate too eagerly, and you look like a starving stranger who snuck in. Devour the terrapin with genuine joy, and you have completely exposed yourself. The wealthy performed boredom at their own banquets, and now so must you, nibbling like a small bird while your stomach files a formal complaint. Understand the strange logic underneath this rule, because it reveals everything about the world you have wandered into. To the very wealthy, abundance was ordinary. Extraordinary food in vast quantity, appeared before them constantly, and treating it as unremarkable was itself a display of status. To show excitement about the meal, to eat as though you were hungry, or as though the food were a rare treat, betrayed that such abundance was not, in fact, your everyday reality. Restraint signalled that you belonged to a class for whom all this splendour was simply routine. This turned every course into a small performance of indifference. The oysters, the soups, the elaborate entrees, the prized game, all of it was to be sampled lightly and set aside, tasted rather than truly eaten, appreciated with a cool detachment rather than any vulgar enthusiasm. You took modest, measured bites. You left food on your plate on purpose. You treated a feast that represented a fortune as though it were pleasant but ultimately unimportant, a mere backdrop to conversation. For a genuinely hungry newcomer, this was a special kind of torture. Here was more magnificent food than you had perhaps ever seen, course after course of it, and you were forbidden from actually enjoying it in any visible way. Your body wanted to eat. Your instincts wanted to appreciate the rare and wonderful dishes in front of you, and the rules demanded that you suppress all of it, that you push the food around delicately and wear an expression of mild, aristocratic boredom throughout. The performance extended to your whole demeanour, not just your fork. You were meant to be more interested in the conversation than the meal, more engaged with your dinner partner than with the plate before you. Eating was to appear almost incidental, something your hands did quietly while your real attention floated elsewhere, on witty talk and gracious company. To be caught gazing hungrily at an approaching course, or eating with obvious relish, was to reveal a want you were supposed to be far above. There was a deeper cruelty in this than in any single fork or rule. The entire lavish meal, all that expense and effort and endless procession of luxury, existed in part to be conspicuously underappreciated by the very people it was meant to impress. The abundance was the point, and treating that abundance as nothing was the flex. You were surrounded by riches you were required to find unremarkable. So you sit amid this ocean of food, genuinely hungry, quietly overwhelmed, and you eat like a bird who's not even sure it wants the seed. You take the smallest polite bites. You leave the beautiful dishes half finished. You keep your expression cool and your attention fixed on the conversation, performing a boredom you do not feel about a feast you would very much like to actually eat. In the Gilded Age, even your appetite had to lie, and yours, right now, is a truly terrible liar. Beyond the forks and the glasses lies an entire battlefield of table manners, any single one of which can quietly undo you. Elbows on the table, forbidden. Reaching across anyone for anything, unthinkable. Speaking with food in your mouth, absolutely catastrophic. You must sit upright as a fence post, bring the food up to your face rather than lowering your face down to the food, and keep your free hand resting in your lap in the American style, or on the table edge in the European style, and choosing wrong announces to everyone exactly where you learned your manners. Every small gesture is a tiny performance being silently graded. You have hundreds of little chances to fail tonight, and you have already quietly used up several of them. Start with posture, because it governed everything. You were expected to sit straight and composed throughout the entire meal, shoulders back, spine upright, for the full 3 or 4 hours of it. No slouching, no leaning back in comfort, no propping yourself on the table when fatigue set in. The rigid formal clothing helped enforce this, but the expectation ran deeper than fabric. A well-bred person simply held themselves with control at the table, and any collapse into comfort revealed a lack of proper training. Then there were the hands, which had their own strict laws. Elbows never rested on the table while you were eating. You did not gesture with your loaded fork to emphasize a point in conversation. You did not reach across a neighbour to retrieve something, but instead waited for it to be passed or quietly asked. Bread was broken into small pieces with your fingers rather than cut or bitten whole. Each of these was a small learned habit, invisible to those raised with it and treacherous to those who were not. The very way you handled your utensils could betray you. There was the American style, in which you cut your food, set the knife down, switched the fork to your other hand and lifted the bite, and there was the continental style in which the fork stayed put and both utensils remained in constant use. Neither was truly wrong, but the choice quietly signalled your background and your influences, and doing either one clumsily or switching awkwardly between them drew exactly the sort of notice you hoped to avoid. Even the napkin carried its own etiquette. You placed it in your lap, not tucked into your collar like a bib, and you used it discreetly to dab rather than scrub at your mouth. When you paused during the meal, your utensils rested in one position on the plate, and when you finished a course, they rested in another, silently telling the servants whether to clear your plate. It was a small language of placement, understood by everyone at the table and by the staff along the walls. What made all of this so exhausting was the sheer number of rules and the total silence with which violations were judged. There was no single dramatic mistake that could doom you, but rather an endless field of tiny ones, any of which might be noticed and remembered, and no one would ever tell you when you erred. The disapproval was silent, internal, filed away behind a pleasant expression, which meant you never quite knew how you were doing. So you sit rigidly upright, elbows tucked, napkin in your lap, choosing your utensil style and praying you commit to it convincingly, never reaching, never gesturing, never speaking through a mouthful, performing 100 small acts of control at once. It is like walking through a field of invisible tripwires while smiling and making light conversation. You have probably already brushed against several of them, and the courses, mercifully or not, keep on coming. Now for the strangest rule of the entire evening, the one that governs who you are even allowed to speak to. It was called turning the table. For the first half of the meal, you speak only to the dinner partner seated on one side of you, and then, at some invisible signal led quietly by the hostess, the entire table pivots and everyone switches to the partner on their other side. You do not get to choose. You do not get to escape a dull conversation early. If your first partner is fascinating, too bad, the table turns. If your first partner is a tedious man describing his railway holdings in agonizing detail, also too bad, because until the table turns, he is your entire world. Understand how this bizarre mechanism actually worked. At the start of the meal, the hostess would turn to speak with the gentleman on one particular side of her, and by doing so she set the direction for the entire table. Following her lead, everyone else turned the same way, each person conversing with the partner on that side. Then, partway through the meal, the hostess would turn to her other neighbour, and the whole table would dutifully pivot with her, everyone shifting their attention to the partner on their opposite side. It was a coordinated social manoeuvre executed by an entire room of people at once. The purpose behind it was, in theory, fairness. The custom ensured that both of the people seated beside any given guest received a share of conversation, so that no one was left ignored while their neighbour chatted merrily on their other side. In a rigidly organised meal where seating and pairing had all been carefully arranged, this was simply one more piece of orchestration, a way of distributing conversation evenly across the table like a well-managed resource. But for you, it meant a total loss of control over your own social fate. You did not get to gravitate naturally toward the interesting person, or drift away from the boring one. Your conversational partners were assigned by seating and rationed by the turning of the table. For the first stretch of the meal, one neighbour was your only permitted companion, and for the second stretch, the other. Whether you found either of them bearable was entirely a matter of luck. This created some genuinely excruciating situations. Imagine being seated beside a delightful, witty companion during the first half, deep in the best conversation of your evening, only to have the hostess turn and the entire table swing away from you, forcing you to abandon the good talk and pivot toward a stranger who wishes to discuss the weather in exhausting detail. Or imagine the reverse, being trapped for the entire first half beside someone insufferable, watching the clock, praying for the turn that will finally release you. The whole thing also demanded a certain vigilance. You had to notice when the table turned, catching the subtle shift led by the hostess so that you pivoted at the right moment along with everyone else. Failing to notice, and continuing to talk to a partner who'd already turned away to their other neighbour, left you stranded mid-sentence, addressing the back of someone's head. It was one more small cue you were expected to read instinctively. So you make conversation with the partner assigned to your one side, whether they enchant you or bore you into a stupor, and you wait, powerless, for the invisible signal. Eventually the hostess turns, the whole table swings like a slow tide, and you obediently pivot to face your other neighbour and begin all over again. You have no say in any of it. In the Gilded Age, even the direction of your own conversation was decided for you, one graceful, coordinated turn at a time. So you're finally talking, but there is a landmine buried in every sentence, because polite dinner conversation came with a long and unforgiving list of forbidden subjects. You may not discuss money, which is deeply ironic given that everyone in the room is quietly drowning in it. You may not discuss politics, religion, illness, or anything remotely unpleasant. You certainly may not ask direct personal questions or say anything that could be considered clever at someone else's expense. What remains is a narrow little island of acceptable topics: the opera, the weather, travel, and gentle flattery. You must be endlessly charming while saying absolutely nothing. It's like trying to win a game where the only permitted move is to stand very still and compliment the wallpaper. Begin with money, the great unspoken subject, because its forbiddenness was the most revealing of all. This was a room full of people whose entire lives revolved around enormous wealth, and yet directly discussing money, asking what something cost, mentioning prices or fortunes or income was considered deeply vulgar. Wealth was everywhere in evidence, in the mansion, the food, the jewels, the silver, but naming it aloud broke the spell. The rich preferred their money felt rather than mentioned. Politics and religion were the classic forbidden pair, and for good reason. Both could spark disagreement, and disagreement at a polite dinner was a genuine breach of the peace the whole occasion was meant to preserve. You did not air your political views, you didn't debate religious matters, and you did not wade into any subject on which reasonable guests might passionately differ. The goal was harmony, not honesty, and honesty had an unfortunate habit of causing friction. Then came the broad category of the unpleasant, which was to be avoided entirely. You did not discuss illness, death, scandal, or anything grim or distressing. You did not bring up your own troubles or dwell on anyone else's. Dinner conversation was meant to be light and agreeable, a pleasant hum that soothed rather than provoked. Introducing something dark or uncomfortable was like turning off the music at a party, a small act of social sabotage. Personal questions were their own delicate hazard. You did not interrogate your dinner partner about private matters, pry into their affairs, or push a conversation toward anything too intimate too quickly. Curiosity, however natural, had to be restrained behind a polite surface, and cleverness itself was dangerous when it came at another's expense, because wit that wounded, however funny, made you seem sharp and untrustworthy rather than charming. What remained after all these prohibitions was a genuinely tiny territory of safe subjects: the opera and the theatre, recent travels, art, the weather, harmless pleasantries, and generous compliments. Within this narrow space, you're expected to be delightful, engaging, and effortlessly charming, holding your partner's interest for the length of a very long meal without ever once straying into forbidden ground. You had to be captivating while saying nothing of any real substance whatsoever, so you steer carefully between all the landmines, praising the opera you may not have seen, remarking on the pleasant weather, inquiring gently about your partner's summer travels, offering warm and weightless compliments. You keep every genuinely interesting thought locked firmly behind your teeth, and as you smile and murmur agreeable nothings for the third straight hour, you begin to understand the true difficulty of the Gilded Age dinner. It was never really about the food. It was about talking endlessly, charmingly, and safely, without ever accidentally saying anything at all. Take a quiet moment to notice the servants, because they are most certainly noticing you. Standing silently against the walls is a small army of footmen and maids in crisp livery, sometimes one for every 2 guests in the very grandest homes, moving plates, refilling glasses, and observing absolutely everything. They are trained to be invisible, and yet they see every fumble, every wrong fork, every panicked sideways glance you make at your neighbour's hands to copy what they're doing. And here is the quiet horror. Servants talked. Below stairs, gossip travelled between the great houses like electricity, so your mistakes tonight might be common knowledge in 3 other mansions by the weekend. You're not just performing for this table, you're performing for the entire city. Start with the sheer number of them, because a great household ran on an enormous staff. Serving a formal dinner of many courses to many guests required a small workforce moving in careful coordination, footmen to carry and present and clear, others to pour the wines, still more managing the flow between the kitchen and the dining room. In the very grandest homes, the ratio of servants to guests was lavish, ensuring that every diner was attended to almost constantly, and that the endless courses arrived and departed with seamless precision. Their training aimed at a kind of dignified invisibility. A well-drilled footman moved quietly, spoke only when necessary, and performed his duties without ever seeming to intrude on the guests or their conversation. He was meant to fade into the background, a smoothly functioning part of the machinery of the evening rather than a person to be acknowledged. The illusion was that the food simply appeared and vanished on its own, borne along by unseen hands. But invisible did not mean unseeing. From their positions along the walls and at your shoulder, the servants had a clear and constant view of everything that happened at the table. They saw who used the wrong fork, who fumbled the finger bowl, who drank a little too freely, who glanced nervously at a neighbour to figure out what to do next. They witnessed every small triumph and every quiet disaster, all while maintaining perfectly neutral expressions that betrayed nothing. And this is where the real danger lay, because the world below stairs had its own thriving network of communication. Servants moved between households, knew one another, and exchanged news and gossip about the families they served and the guests who passed through. A notable blunder at one table could become a quietly shared story that rippled outward through the servants' halls of the city, reaching other households and eventually other employers. Your reputation could be shaped in rooms you would never see, by people you barely noticed. There was also the matter of how you treated them, which was itself a test. The truly well-bred guest acknowledged the service smoothly and courteously, without making a fuss, neither ignoring the staff rudely, nor over-apologizing and drawing attention to them. Treating servants with careless contempt marked you as coarse, while flustered awkwardness around them marked you as unaccustomed to being served. Even here, in your interactions with the quiet figures along the walls, you are being measured. So you sit at the glittering table, focused on your forks and your forbidden topics, and your unreadable hostess, while all around you a silent, watchful staff observes your every move with practiced neutrality. They will say nothing tonight. Their faces will remain perfectly composed, but the story of how you conducted yourself may well be told later, in a kitchen you will never enter and carried outward through the great houses of the city. You're performing for far more people than you think, and now we arrive at the single most famous trap of the whole evening, the finger bowl. Near the end of the meal, a small bowl of water, sometimes with a slice of lemon or a single flower petal floating in it, is placed gently in front of you. It looks to the untrained and thoroughly exhausted diner exactly like a charming little drink. It is not a little drink. It is for delicately rinsing your fingertips, one hand at a time, and then quietly patting them dry on your napkin. History is full of unfortunate souls who lifted that bowl and sipped from it, sealing their social fate in a single gulp. You look at the bowl. You look at the floating lemon. You're so incredibly thirsty. Do not do it. Whatever you do, do not do it. Understand first what the finger bowl was actually for, since its purpose was perfectly reasonable and its appearance was perfectly treacherous. After a long meal that might have involved handling fruit or other foods with the fingers, a small bowl of water was provided so guests could rinse their fingertips clean at the table. It was a practical little courtesy, a way to freshen up before the meal drew to its close. Sometimes a slice of lemon or a petal floated in the water, partly for fragrance and partly for elegance. The method of using it was quiet and precise. You dipped your fingertips gently into the water, one hand at a time, rinsed them lightly, and then dried them discreetly on your napkin in your lap. You did not plunge your whole hand in. You did not splash, and you most certainly did not drink from it. It was a small, understated gesture, performed almost invisibly, in keeping with the general principle that everything at this table should be done with minimal fuss. But to the uninitiated, and especially to a tired, thirsty guest many courses deep into a long meal, the finger bowl was a perfect and deadly disguise. It looked, for all the world, like a delicate serving of water or a light beverage, complete with a floating garnish that only reinforced the illusion. And so, the great enduring legend of the finger bowl was born. The tale of the poor soul who, mistaking it for a drink, lifted the little bowl and sipped from it in front of the entire refined table. Whether every version of that story is strictly true hardly matters, because the fear it captured was very real. To drink from the finger bowl was to reveal, instantly and unmistakably, that you did not know the rules, that you had never been to a table like this before, that you did not belong. It was the kind of mistake that could define you, a single gulp that turned you into a cautionary tale whispered about long after the evening ended. There is even a gracious legend attached to it, the story of a host who, seeing a bewildered guest drink from the finger bowl, calmly lifted his own and drank too to spare the guest embarrassment. True or not, the tale endures because it captures both the cruelty of the trap and the rare kindness of the truly secure. Most tables, however, would offer no such mercy. Most would simply watch and remember and quietly judge. So the little bowl arrives, water gleaming, lemon slice floating temptingly, and every parched instinct in your body urges you to lift it and drink. You're exhausted, you're thirsty, and it looks so much like relief. Do not do it. Dip your fingertips, rinse them lightly, dry them on your napkin, resist the bowl, and you have dodged the single most famous trap in the entire meal. Give in to it, and you will be remembered for exactly one thing, and it will not be your charm. At long last the sweet courses arrive, signalling that the end may genuinely be near. Puddings, pastries, elaborate moulded creams, and fashionable ices are set before you, often shaped into little sculptures far too pretty to eat, which is a problem, because you absolutely must eat them correctly, with yet another dedicated utensil. There is a spoon for the ices and a fork for the pastries, and mixing them up at this late and delicate stage when victory is finally in sight would be a truly tragic way to fall at the last hurdle. Fresh fruit might appear too, along with the strange and specific challenge of peeling a pear with a knife and fork while under close observation. You're so nearly there. Your corset, however, is not. Begin with the sweets themselves, because they were where the kitchen made its final dazzling impression. After the savoury marathon of soups and fish and roasts and game, the meal turned to its sweet finale, a lavish array of puddings, creams, pastries and confections. These were often elaborate creations, moulded and decorated and presented with real artistry, meant to end the dinner on a note of beauty and indulgence. They looked, in many cases, almost too lovely to disturb with a fork. The ices were a particular highlight of the age. Frozen creams and flavoured ices were fashionable and impressive, requiring skill and equipment to produce, and therefore serving as another quiet display of the household's resources. They arrived cold and elegant, sometimes moulded into decorative shapes, and they came with their own appropriate utensil, a small spoon suited to the task. Eating them correctly meant once again selecting the right tool from your dwindling arsenal. Which brings us to the persistent tyranny of the utensils, still tormenting you even at the very end. The sweet courses had their own dedicated forks and spoons, often laid at the top of your place setting above the plate rather than at the sides. A dessert fork for pastries, a spoon for ices and puddings, each with its proper use. After surviving the entire meal, choosing wrong now on the very last stretch would be a genuinely heartbreaking way to finally reveal yourself. Then, if fresh fruit appeared, came one of the most quietly diabolical challenges of the whole evening. Eating fruit politely at a formal table often meant not simply picking it up and biting into it, but peeling and cutting it with a knife and fork. Managing to peel a pear or an apple neatly with utensils, reducing it to tidy pieces without mangling it or sending it skidding across your plate, was a genuine feat of coordination, and doing it gracefully under the watchful eyes of the table required real practice you almost certainly lacked. And through all of this, your body was reaching its absolute limit. You had eaten your way through an enormous number of courses, sealed the entire time into unyielding formal wear, and now, at the sweet finale, you were expected to accept and taste yet more food with the same poise and restraint you had maintained since the oysters. The end was in sight, but the meal was determined to test you right up until the final bite. So the beautiful sweets and the elegant ices arrive, and you reach, carefully, for what you hope is the correct final utensil, praying you have not fumbled the choice at the last possible moment. You navigate the pastry, the frozen cream, perhaps even a treacherous pear, with the last of your fading composure. You're almost through the entire ordeal now, so close to the end you can taste it, and it tastes like sugar and relief. Just do not celebrate too soon. There is still one more strange ritual to come, just when everyone is finally full and the ordeal seems mercifully finished. The meal performs one last bizarre maneuver. The hostess rises, and with her, all the women at the table stand and withdraw from the dining room entirely, leaving the men behind. This was tradition, a moment for the ladies to retire to the drawing room for coffee and quiet conversation, while the gentlemen remained seated at the table. If you are a woman, you must rise gracefully and glide out with the group, timing your exit perfectly with the rest. If you are a man, you must stand politely as they leave and then settle right back down into what is somehow yet another entire phase of the evening. The party is not over. The party is never, ever over. Understand the tradition first, because it was a long-established custom of formal dining. After the meal proper had ended, the hostess would signal the moment by rising from her seat, and at this cue all the women present would stand and leave the dining room together, withdrawing to another room, often the drawing room. The men remained behind at the table. It was a formal parting of the sexes, a scheduled division of the party into two separate gatherings for a time. The signal itself was subtle but unmistakable, and reading it correctly was essential. The hostess did not announce the withdrawal loudly. She simply rose, perhaps catching the eye of the other ladies, and the women were expected to notice and rise with her more or less in unison. For a guest, this meant staying alert to the moment, standing promptly and gracefully when it came, and moving with the group rather than lingering awkwardly or worse, failing to notice and remaining seated among the men. For the departing women, the withdrawal led to its own softer social setting. In the drawing room, the ladies gathered for coffee and conversation, a chance to talk among themselves in a more relaxed atmosphere, free of the rigid seating and the assigned partners of the dinner table. This was not simply idle time, it was its own arena of socializing, where relationships were maintained, impressions were formed, and the ever-present currents of society continued to flow, just in a different room and a different key. For the men left behind, the dining room transformed into a different kind of gathering entirely, one we will explore next. The point for now is that the meal did not simply end when the food ran out. Instead, it fractured into a new configuration, the party splitting in two, each half continuing the evening in its own way before eventually reuniting later. What had felt like the finish line turned out to be merely another transition, and so the guest who imagined the ordeal was over discovered that it was, in fact, ongoing. There was no clean ending, no moment where you could simply exhale and relax. The withdrawal introduced fresh etiquette to navigate, fresh timing to read, and a fresh social setting to survive. Whether you followed the ladies to the drawing room or remained at the table with the men, the evening kept generating new tests, one after another, long after you assumed it must be finished. So the hostess rises, and in a graceful ripple the women stand and glide from the room together, leaving the men to settle back into their chairs. If you are among the departing ladies, you rise smoothly with them and hope your timing match the group. If you are among the men, you stand as they leave and then sit once more, realizing with a sinking feeling that yet another chapter of the evening is only just beginning. In the Gilded Age, the meal did not end. It simply changed rooms. With the women gone, the men remain at the table for port and cigars, and the whole mood shifts into a low haze of smoke and important-sounding conversation. This is where real business was quietly done, where deals and opinions and railway fortunes were passed around the table, along with the decanter, which by strict custom was always slid to the left and never once lifted straight across. If you are a man badly out of your depth, this is a brand new kind of danger, because now the safe, polite topics of dinner give way to hard talk of markets and money, and you are expected to have opinions you do not actually possess. You swirl your port thoughtfully, you nod at the right moments, you pray with all your heart that no one asks you a direct question. Begin with the setting, because the atmosphere itself changed the instant the ladies departed. The dining room, moments ago a place of careful, restrained conversation, loosened slightly into a more relaxed and masculine gathering. Cigars were lit, filling the air with smoke, and fortified wine, most famously port, was brought out for the men to enjoy. The rigid conversational rules of the mixed table relaxed just enough to allow talk that would have been unwelcome in front of the ladies. Now the port itself came with its own beloved and very specific ritual, one that trapped the unwary as surely as any finger bowl. The decanter of port was passed around the table in one direction, traditionally to the left, moving from guest to guest so each could fill his glass before sending it onward. You did not reach across the table for it, and you did not simply hold on to it. You served yourself and passed it along to your left, keeping the decanter circulating in its proper direction. Breaking this small ceremony, hoarding the port or sending it the wrong way, marked you instantly among men who took the custom seriously. The conversation was where the true peril lay for an outsider. With the women withdrawn, the talk often turned to subjects considered unsuitable for mixed company, and in this era of tycoons and speculation that frequently meant business, markets, investments, and the making and moving of great fortunes. This was where deals were quietly advanced, where opinions on commerce and finance were exchanged, where the real machinery of the moneyed world sometimes turned, and you were expected to participate as though you belonged among them. For a man out of his depth, this was a fresh nightmare. The comfortable, weightless topics of the dinner table, the opera and the weather and the pleasant travels were gone. In their place came pointed talk of enterprises and earnings, delivered by men who commanded real wealth and expected you to hold your own. You could not confess ignorance, and you could not stay entirely silent without seeming dull or evasive. You had to project the easy confidence of someone who understood these matters, while frantically hoping the conversation would never turn directly to you. The whole interlude carried its own test of composure. You had to handle your port and your cigar with practiced ease, pass the decanter correctly, contribute to the conversation without overreaching, and generally comport yourself as a man comfortable in the company of the powerful. It was the dinner's social demands transposed into a new key, smokier and looser but no less watchful, no less quick to notice the man who did not quite fit. So you sit amid the drifting cigar smoke, glass of port in hand, passing the decanter dutifully to your left, nodding along to talk of markets and fortunes you do not begin to understand. You swirl your port with the thoughtful air of a serious man. You murmur vague agreement at the right moments, and you pray, above all, that no one turns to you and asks your opinion directly, because the moment you open your mouth, the entire careful illusion may come crashing down. Eventually, mercifully, it is time to leave, and yes, even leaving comes with its own rules. You do not simply bolt for the door the very moment you are physically able, no matter how desperately your feet, your stomach, and your soul are begging you to. Leaving too early quietly insults the hostess, while lingering too late marks you as someone who cannot read a room. You must find the host and hostess, offer brief and gracious thanks, say nothing especially memorable, and then retrieve your coat and your carriage in one smooth, unhurried, dignified exit. And the very next day, etiquette demanded that you send a note or leave a card thanking them properly all over again. The dinner is finally over, but the paperwork, as always, is not. Start with the timing, because departure was governed by the same tyranny of the correct moment that ruled arrival. You could not leave the instant the meal and its aftermath concluded, because bolting for the door the moment you were able suggested you had merely endured the evening rather than enjoyed it, a quiet insult to your hosts. But you also could not overstay, lingering long after the natural end of the gathering, because that marked you as someone who could not sense when an evening was properly finished. There was, as always, a narrow correct window, and you were expected to feel your way to it. Then there was the manner of the farewell itself. Before leaving, you sought out the host and especially the hostess to offer your thanks and take your leave properly. This farewell, like every other exchange of the evening, was to be gracious but brief, warm but not lingering. You expressed your gratitude for a delightful evening. You said something pleasant and forgettable, and you did not monopolize your host's attention or turn your departure into a drawn-out production. You thanked them, and you moved on. The mechanics of the exit called for the same smooth composure you had struggled to maintain all night. Your coat, your hat, and your wraps were retrieved by servants. Your carriage was summoned. You made your way out without appearing rushed or flustered, gliding through the final moments of the evening with the same practiced ease that the whole occasion had demanded from the very first announcement of your name. Even now, at the end, you were being observed, and even now, poise mattered. But here is the part that reveals just how relentless this world truly was. The obligation did not end when you left the mansion. Etiquette demanded that in the days following the dinner, you acknowledge your host's hospitality once more, typically by sending a note of thanks or leaving a card. This was not optional courtesy, but expected practice, a way of properly closing the social exchange that the invitation had opened. The dinner generated its own follow-up correspondence, a final piece of the endless paperwork of society, and in a sense this closing ritual mirrored the opening one perfectly. Your entry into the evening had begun with cards and formal replies, the careful paper machinery of being invited, and now your exit trailed off into more of the same, the note or card that properly acknowledged the honour of having been included. The whole affair was bookended by etiquette, wrapped from beginning to end in small obligatory gestures that never quite let you simply relax and be done. So you find your hosts, offer your brief and gracious thanks, retrieve your coat, and step out into the night at exactly the right moment, neither too soon nor too late, gliding away with the last of your carefully maintained composure. You have survived the dinner itself, and yet, as your carriage pulls away from the glittering mansion, you remember that tomorrow you must sit down and write a note of thanks, because in the Gilded Age, even leaving a party correctly came with homework. So how did you do? Over the course of a single evening, you navigated an invisible invitation system, strapped yourself into clothing built entirely for suffering, got announced to a hostile room, greeted a woman who could erase you with a look, marched in ceremonial order to a table you could not read, survived 20 courses and a small lake of wine, obeyed 100 silent rules of conduct, and somehow, against all odds, resisted the urge to drink from the finger bowl. Or maybe you did not. Maybe you grabbed the wrong fork, laughed a little too loudly, mentioned money, and lifted that innocent little bowl of lemon water straight to your lips. Either way, welcome to a single night in Gilded Age high society, where the food was endless, the rules were merciless, and belonging was the one thing that all that money could only almost buy. Let's take stock of the sheer scale of what you were up against. This was not a dinner in any sense you would recognise. It was an elaborate hours-long endurance test disguised as a meal, governed by rules that touched everything from the paper you replied on to the direction you passed the port. Every stage of the evening, from the calling cards to the farewell note, carried its own etiquette, its own opportunities to succeed quietly or to fail memorably. And nobody handed you the rule book. You were simply expected to already know. Consider what actually made survival possible for the people who belonged there. It was not intelligence, or charm, or even wealth alone. It was a lifetime of training, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that the entire performance became second nature. They chose the right fork without thinking, sipped their soup in the correct direction by pure habit, read the turning of the table and the rising of the hostess instinctively. What terrified you was simply their ordinary evening, rehearsed since childhood until it required no thought at all. And consider what all these rules were truly for, because that is the real revelation of the Gilded Age dinner. The forks and the finger bowls and the forbidden topics were never really about food or cleanliness or conversation. They were a filter, an elaborate and unspoken system designed to separate those who had been raised in this world from those who had merely arrived in it. The whole evening was a test of belonging, and the test was rigged in favour of people who had been taking it their entire lives. This is why money alone was never enough, and why the newly rich of the age poured so much effort into learning these rituals. You could build a mansion on Fifth Avenue and fill it with treasures, but if you drank from the finger bowl or passed the port the wrong way, you revealed that your wealth was new and your training absent. The old families guarded their world not with walls but with etiquette, with 10,000 tiny rules that money could not instantly purchase. Belonging had to be performed flawlessly, and performance took years. So picture yourself at the end of it all, exhausted and overfed and slightly drunk, having stumbled through an evening designed to expose you at every turn. Perhaps you performed well enough to be invited again. Perhaps you committed some small unforgivable sin that will quietly follow you. Either way, you have glimpsed the strange, glittering, merciless machinery of Gilded Age society, a world where a shared meal was a battlefield and a single fork could decide your fate. And that, in the end, is why you would not survive a Gilded Age dinner party. Not because you lacked wealth, or wit, or good intentions, but because you were never trained for the 1,000 invisible tests waiting in that candlelit room. You would arrive hopeful, navigate a few courses on nerve alone, and somewhere between the wrong fork and the tempting finger bowl you would quietly give yourself away. The rich made it all look effortless. It never was. It was simply a lifetime of practice, dressed up in silk and served on silver, and pretending to be nothing at all. So there you have it. In the span of one single evening, you decoded an invitation written in the secret language of folded cards, laced yourself into clothing built to punish, walked into a hostile room to the sound of your own announced name, and sat down before more than a dozen forks arranged like a small silver army. You survived 20 courses and a slow tide of wine, held your tongue on every interesting subject, dodged the tempting little finger bowl, and passed the port carefully to your left, all while pretending none of it required a single ounce of effort. It was exhausting, it was absurd, and it was somehow considered a lovely night out. There is something quietly wonderful about all of it, though. These were people who turned dinner into theatre, who built palaces just to eat in them, and who wrapped an ordinary meal in 10,000 tiny rules simply to prove they belonged. It was ridiculous, yes, but it was also human, this endless, glittering effort to find a place among one another. Beneath the corsets and the calling cards were people longing to be included exactly as we all still are. So tonight, as you settle into your soft bed in whatever comfortable, unstructured clothing you please, take a quiet moment to be grateful. You can eat with any fork you like. You can drink from any glass. You can talk about anything at all, laugh as loudly as you want, and leave the table whenever you please, and no one will remember it forever. The Gilded Age was beautiful and merciless and a little bit silly, and you would never have survived it. But you do not have to. You get to rest instead. So close your eyes, breathe easy, and let the candlelight fade. Good night.